Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. You know, every person counts. I believe we can all make a difference. We can all have an impact. This is a film that this is probably the 5th time I'm seeing it, and I have to admit it never gets easier. It's very difficult. I normally apologize for people for even having to watch it, but then you can imagine the pain that the victim. Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to second the welcome to this film. It's an extraordinary document of what happened to people in northern Uganda, and it's actually still going on. Just in the past few weeks, there have been a spate of a couple of people have been killed, but several thousand people have been had their huts burned down and have been chased off their land, basically to make way for investors who are linked to the ruling party up in northern Uganda. So it really continues.
Can you hear?
No,
Sorry about that. Thanks so much. Yeah. So this, but this powerful document, I think, really does give such an up-close human picture of what the consequences of our meddling in this region have wrought. I think it really is really remarkable. But I have to say, it really is it's the tip of the iceberg, in fact, of what Museveni has been responsible for. Uganda has been known, for those who think about it at all and know anything about what's going on in that region, it's really known as a kind of island of stability in a turbulent region. It's bordered by Sudan. It used to be Sudan, now South Sudan, Congo, Rwanda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And many of those countries, as you know, have been at war over the past, during the past 30 years. Museveni has been involved in every single one of those wars in much the same way that he was involved in, his army was involved in northern Uganda, doing very, very similar things. As you probably are all familiar with the Rwanda genocide, the Rwanda genocide was preceded by an invasion of Rwanda in 1990 by rebels who had been trained and supplied by Yoweri Museveni. In 1990, they set up camps in northern Rwanda and began terrorizing the local people there, who were members of the Hutu tribe, if you are familiar with that story. And about 1 million of them fled south into IDP camps. And that went on for about 3.5 years until finally the genocide erupted and people who were in militias had been formed and over that period, and these sort of Hutu-led militias, and they began striking back at every Tutsi they could find, massacred hundreds of thousands of them. But that atrocity has been compared to the Holocaust in Germany, but there's a very significant difference, which is that there was no Jewish army threatening Hitler's Germany, but there was an army that had been armed and backed by Museveni that had been terrorizing people of Rwanda for 3.5 years, absolutely needlessly. And after those Museveni's proteges took over Rwanda, they then marched on and invaded Congo. And that war went on for officially for about 7 years, but it actually continues to this day. There's still massacres going on. And about several million people lost their lives in that one. And then more recently, Museveni has been meddling in South Sudan, exacerbated that conflict and prolonged it. He's involved in Somalia and so on. And yet, all of this is virtually unknown. But this films like A Brilliant Genocide and people like you who are willing to watch films like this and are willing to come out on a rainy day and actually participate in events like this, I can't tell you how important that is. It really is. Because it helps the word get out, and it's the silence surrounding this that is the greatest ongoing atrocity, really. It's just really shocking.
So, again, I apologize. It's very difficult for me to watch this film. But as I said, we can all have impact. Museveni cannot survive without U.S. military financial support. And there's no justification for this at all. Museveni's government gets about $1 billion annually, your taxpayers' dollars, so we can make this stop. We can contact our elected representatives, members of Congress, senators, and said this cannot be done with my taxpayers' dollars. It must stop. We must stop his capacity to inflict terror in Uganda and in the region, as Helen has outlined. He is directly responsible for the deaths of millions of Africans in Uganda, in Rwanda, in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, and in Somalia. Everywhere Ugandan soldiers have been, the footprints is terror and death. Had Uganda not invaded Rwanda October 1, 1990, the massacres and the genocide 4 years later might not have happened. It would not have happened. It's almost like Pakistan financing an insurgency into India composed primarily of Muslims. And then the Prime Minister of India gets killed, assassinated when her plane or his plane is shot down. What do you think would happen? And let's say that invading force actually takes control of the entire country. What do you think would happen in India? That's the comparison that I like to draw, so people can get an understanding of what happened in Rwanda. Paul Kagame, who is today the president of Rwanda, was actually the chief of military intelligence in Uganda's army. So this was like payback for the ethnic Tutsis whose families had fled the massacres in 1959, 1960, when the revolution happened there and the monarchy was overthrown. So many ethnic Tutsis fled to other East African countries. And then they grew up there. So that's how people like Kagame ended up fighting alongside Museveni when he seized power in 1986. So this was like payback. He financed them and allowed them to invade. But essentially, it was the Ugandan army invading Rwanda. And the war continued for 4 years until the massacres and the genocide was triggered when that plane was shot down. There's a film that is worth watching. It's called Rwanda's Untold Story. I think it's available on YouTube. It's never been shown in the United States by any major outlet, just like this documentary will probably never be shown in the US by any major outlet. That's why it's very important for us to have these kind of screenings and to have people to become actively involved. And as you saw, the website was shown at the end of the film, or you can go to abrilliantgenocide.com and you'll find the information about the petition. You'll find information about Ebony Butler, who's a unique human being, young Australian lady. She went to Uganda and she could have told the narrative that every other journalist who works for corporate media essentially was telling. that the only problem in Uganda is Joseph Kony. And now we see how Kony was actually a very convenient instrument for Museveni to carry out his agenda. He needed Joseph Kony. In fact, there are many occasions, as you heard one of his top commanders, General Sedusa, say, when they could have destroyed Kony. But then what would they have been left with? He would have had to account, wait, why are you then still ruling Uganda with your militaristic regime? Who are you fighting if there's no Joseph Kony? So he needed Joseph Kony more than even Joseph Kony needed Museveni. And then as Helen also said, look at the conflict in South Sudan right now, where you had two people who had a political dispute, the current president Salva Kiir and his vice president Riek Machar. Other regional African countries wanted to resolve that politically, but what did Museveni do? He intervened militarily on the side of one of those individuals, President Riek Machar. And that's Salva Kiir, I'm sorry. And that's how the violence escalated all these years, all these massacres. And I'm sure some of you read about it. We did, and thank you for Brooklyn the Peace for hosting that event on South Sudan, that we discussed that issue and Museveni's role in those atrocities too. So that's why I think it's very important for people that are committed and interested to get in touch with our elected representatives, because they can make it happen. There's no need to fund essentially a president who is a terrorist in East and Central Africa.
Thank you very much, and I really knew nothing about this, next to nothing, even though Uganda was the first country I'd ever been in Africa, but it was in 1972, right before Idi Amin took over, and I went to Kenya intending to go back to Uganda, but I couldn't. But there's one thing that I'm not clear at all about, in spite of all the information that you gave, is to what really was it that they stood to gain in northern Uganda by this kind of atrocity? Both Museveni and the United States government and any of the Western powers.
Whose interest was what were the interests involved? I think it was very complicated. You have to go back to the end of the Cold War, when sort of the chessboard of the world was kind of shifting, and the Soviet threat was receding, but the Islamist threat was emerging. And Sudan, which was then intact, there was no South Sudan, is Uganda's northern neighbor, and had been our Cold War friend. It had been our Uganda, and essentially with a very sort of repressive regimes and so on that received lots and lots of U.S. aid right up until the 1980s. And then there was a coup in 1989, right around the time of the Berlin Wall collapse, and everything's changing and so on. And a sort of Islamist team took over. One of them was a cleric called Hassan al-Turabi, and Omar al-Bashir, an army colonel, overthrew the previous government in a coup. And Turabi in particular had been sort of talking about creating a global caliphate. He decided to host Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda and all sorts of other groups that were not, that we were afraid of, or Washington was afraid of. And Museveni, as it happens, had been an old school friend of a man named John Garang, who had a kind of ragtag rebel group called the Sudan People's Liberation Army that had been fighting the government of South Sudan, the previous one, as well as the new one, for years, many years, decade at least, and then part of this sort of South Sudanese rebellion that had been going on since the 50s. And Museveni began supporting him, sending his troops in to fight alongside him. Even Sejusa fought alongside him, the guy in the movie, back in 1988, along with Garang. And then the Americans got involved because they were interested in destabilizing Sudan, because they were worried about Sudan's links to terrorist groups, and those terrorist groups were interested in fighting Mubarak in Egypt and toppling him and having a Muslim government there and undoing Egypt's peace deal with Israel. So it was very complicated. There was a whole sort of chain of relationships throughout the region. And so that's when Museveni became our friend. That's when Reagan started inviting him to the White House. He was this greenhorn African leader. He took over by force in 1986. Suddenly he's visiting the White House every year, 87, 88, 89. He hires Reagan's son-in-law as his press agent. And since has had more contact at high level with American leaders than any living African leader. And yet nobody knows who he is. And he started doing our dirty work. So the situation in northern Uganda was really, Museveni got involved in sort of proxy wars in all these various neighboring countries. So Museveni was supporting John Garang, and so in retaliation, Bashir of Sudan began supporting Joseph Kony and other anti-Museveni rebel groups. And Museveni found this convenient, actually. He could have wiped out Joseph Kony just like that. He had many opportunities to do so. But instead, he kind of found it convenient to have an excuse to kind of pummel the people of northern Uganda because they had been the leaders, they had been the sort of the tribe, so to speak, or the ethnic groups from which the previous leaders had come from. They were smart, they were well-to-do, they were politically very astute, and they were rich, they had a lot of cows, and his men wanted them. And they took every cow, there were hundreds of thousands of animals up there, they were left with virtually none. They wanted their land, they wanted to repress them and build up the southern tribes that had previously been underneath northern leaders who weren't so wonderful either, but they were nothing like as bad as Museveni. So I wish the answer were simpler, but it has to do with this kind of geostrategic situation.
I think she did an excellent job in putting it in the context that makes it a little sensible, even though it's senseless what is being done. The only thing I would also add is she mentioned toward the end is the land component. It's the most sparsely populated part of the country with abundant land, very fertile land, and that's what is going on now that she also mentioned briefly, that the military elite, the political elite, now partnering with foreign so-called investors, kicking people off their land and taking over this land and turning it into partnership with multinationals to produce for mass export. So one of the big things right now is ordinary people, ordinary women in the villages have found the only way that they can protest when confronted by these armed state security agents. They completely disrobe and they lie flat on the road and challenge the soldiers to run over them with their vehicles. And in many cases, is actually stop the soldiers and force them to turn back. Because even some of the most brutal soldiers would never outright kill naked women in many African countries.
First and then
that tactic sounded like something that
I don't think you can reach it, but if you can come over here and we use the mic.
I was saying that some of that tactic was used by Wangari Maathai in Kenya when they were fighting against the government.
Correct.
But I was also interested in the fact that in your groupings of the Central African countries that he was influenced by, you mentioned Tanzania, who has usually been considered peaceful without conflict. I don't know what has happened since Julius Nyerere has passed away, but I was curious about that. And there has to be some kind of, aside from the military and land, but the resources.
Yes,
Which is,
absolutely.
and I was wondering what resources, that was the third part of my question, the resources that they have that the U.S. and West is interested in.
Okay, good. I'm glad you raised that issue, actually. We left that sort of about the land and, of course, valuable natural resources. There have been major discovery of oil in the western and northern parts of Uganda. There's gold in northeastern part of Uganda. So yes, the mineral resources, because it overlaps from the northern part of Uganda and into southern Sudan in terms of the resources. And that also, of course, then brings in the interest of U.S. Corporate interests as well. Very recently, a conglomerate that also includes General Electric signed an oil refinery deal with General Museveni. And that was signed, I think, about 3 weeks ago or so. And it was happily tweeted by the U.S. Ambassador to Uganda, Deborah Malak. And I tweeted back, and I put her hashtag on, and I said, why don't you tweet about the human rights atrocities, about the fact that he's stolen several elections, including the one in 2016. And I say, on the embassy's website in Uganda, there's a speech she made condemning the fact that the election was not free and fair, condemning the fact that money sent to treat TB, malaria, HIV, AIDS was embezzled by government officials. And suddenly she's forgetting her own speech that is still on the website in the U.S. Embassy.
My question, just hold on.
No, that's, yeah, I'm putting it.
Yeah,
Were you about to talk?
I could go on forever.
Oh. Well, my question was also about resources, thank you. But didn't the U.S. also want to cut a whole swath across Africa of land that it controlled? And isn't there also offshore drilling going on now, on both sides of Africa, west and east?
There is drilling for, I think particularly if we go back, for example, to this scenario with Sudan, is part of the reason why they supported the United States wanted to partner with Museveni is he is a pretty good military strategist. And around the time in the late 1980s, early 1990s, he began supporting not only the rebel groups in Sudan, the Southern Sudanese, but also as Milton and I mentioned before, the rebels who went into Rwanda, but also rebels who went into then known as Zaire, now Congo. And they, the point there was really to make sure that Zaire and Congo didn't fall into the hands of an ally of Sudan, because at that time, as I said, the kaleidoscope was really shifting, and Mobutu Sese Seko, who had been our Cold War friend, sort of terrible tyrant in Zaire, a very corrupt guy, but he had then become our enemy because he didn't like Museveni and he didn't like Paul Kagame, and he began to partner with Bashir of Sudan because both of them were annoyed with Museveni for sending rebels into their country. So I think what the Americans saw was, oh my God, Mobutu is going to give these Islamists access to these strategic minerals, particularly in Congo, which is home to $24 trillion worth of unexploited natural resources, including coltan that runs our computers, cell phones, cameras, etc., and is absolute, sort of totally necessary for our modern world. And now Museveni and Kagame actually control those resources. They're henchmen, they're kind of murky traders and businessmen, have smuggled out of Congo billions of dollars of this stuff, along with gold and diamonds and other things, timber, ivory from elephants, I'm afraid. And this, it means, but they do it, the stuff is mainly sort of dug out by slave labor, essentially, children. And it means our computers and cameras and jewelry and everything are affordable, but it comes at an incredible cost. And this is again, a black hole, essentially. Nobody sees it unless you unless you go there, and it's a rough trip.
Yes, I'm glad she brought that aspect up. And that's one of the real reasons why he's actually also sustained in recent years for such a long time. Because the phenomenal wealth of the Congo, particularly in the Eastern Congo. Because obviously, if he and his generals are making millions of dollars, it means that the Western corporate interests are making billions of dollars, because these minerals are not consumed in Uganda. Uganda is not a manufacturing country. None of those countries are. So all these resources are shipped to the West. So they close a blind eye. In Congo, the deaths is estimated at more than $6 million. And yet this is tolerated. Museveni is still invited to the White House. So it means that the lives of Africans is of no consequence. It's seen as collateral damage. In 2005, the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of the Congo when the Congo brought up these alleged crimes, actual crimes by Uganda. Ruled favorably, awarded reparations, $6 to $10 billion. Not a dime has been paid by Uganda. Uganda can't pay it. And Kabila, the current president, has not tried to enforce it. So that's why Uganda also has been trying to maintain Kabila, somebody who's not going to collect on 10 billion owed. But here's an interesting thing that happened. The Congo used the same set of facts to petition the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And there's a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal from June 8, 2006. And it says the ICC did in fact initiate an investigation, and that Museveni himself contacted Kofi Annan, who was at the time the Secretary General of the UN, and urged him to block that investigation. And the article said, Kofi Annan said he didn't have the power to do it. It's interesting. It didn't say he rejected it outright, but he said he did not have the power to do it. But I believe there was some intervention, because if the ICJ could find him liable for the same war crimes, there's no reason why the ICC could not have indicted him. And that's not to say that it would have led to anything, but at least he would have been in the same category as Bashir of the Sudan for the crimes that he committed in Sudan as well. So it shows that Museveni clearly has diplomatic courage and protection at the highest level in the West.
Any more questions?
Question back there.
Okay. State your name.
Marius from Congo. I have a comment and two questions, but I'm going to start by my question. So, when we often ask to, it's like citizens from the UK or from the US to help us, like to remove Museveni or Kabila, I just think that we do the same thing, like they ask the US to send soldiers. So maybe that message should be sent to the people from Congo or from Uganda to take responsibility, to take out
I'll be happy to answer that question.
Museveni. So I want us to take that consideration like in mind. I've been in the US like 3 years ago. Sometimes when I'm listening to certain forum about what's going on in the Great Lake region, as they say, or East Africa, I think that sometimes the narratives change a bit, is Museveni really bad?
Very bad.
Yeah, just like that's my question. So let's suppose in Uganda without Museveni, how the region will be. I don't support him, or I'm not against him, or whatever it is. Just that's a question. Let's suppose we have a Rwanda without Kagame. How the region will look like, how can you perceive the Great Lake region? And we often talk about resources in DRC, and the narratives focus more on, I'm not from the eastern part of DRC, I'm from the west and the central, which is also like very rich. But there's like some very good things going on there, and we don't talk about that. I was watching the documentary that it was well done, but also I think it's good to give a good image. There are like a good things going on.
There's a different forum for that.
Oh, thank you.
Tonight's forum is very different. Okay, right?
I'll come to you, sir.
No, I'll give you. Okay, 3 points. I hope that as a fellow East African, as an African, you're not suggesting that Africa cannot do better and have systems where there are regular elections, there are accountable governments, there's term limits. At the very minimum, I think every society needs term limits. You cannot have one ruler for 32 years, and that's where the excesses and abuses come in place. So if Uganda had term limits observed, there would be no Museveni. There would be no Kagame, one. Number two, Congo can do much better. Congo does not deserve to have 7 million of its citizens annihilated because some Western corporations want to benefit. There's no story that is more overwhelming in the Congo than this story today. What was the third part of his comment?
Why don't the Ugandans rise up and...
Yes, that particular aspect. Ugandans are dying on a daily basis trying to fight Museveni. Anybody can do the research. Just Google Uganda resisting Museveni. During the recent campaign, there was a campaign where he bribed members of parliament to remove what Ugandans were hoping would be at least something that could protect them. Age limit. The Constitution says anybody age 75 and above is not eligible. So by the next election, he would be, if we go by his own words, he would be 76, 77. Some people believe it would be 80. Either way, he would not be eligible. So what did he do? He coerced, bribed members of parliament, intimidated, invaded. Many of you may have seen a YouTube video of people fighting inside Uganda's parliament, and it was mischaracterized as members of parliament that just lost their temper. No, the fighting was initiated by security forces belonging to Museveni, who were dressed up in suits and ties to make it appear as if they were members of parliament. And they were actually beating people, members of parliament, that was filibustering. They didn't have the numbers because he controls the majority. But they were hoping to block this bill to be voted in. But out on the streets, many people were also resisting, and those were shot to death. So Ugandans are doing their part, but we don't think it's right for the regime, which is an illegitimate regime, to be receiving $1 billion from the United States, and we feel obligated to inform Americans that once they have that information, we're also sure that they would not want their taxpayer dollars to be supporting that. And that is why we do what we do.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot for that. That was powerful answer. But one thing you left out, which was during that Parliament raid, which everybody saw on The Daily Show, I think there was a clip there, and everybody was laughing. It was very funny. There was a heroic woman MP there called Betty Nambuz, who is a champion at fighting land grabbing in the south of the country, because it's happening there too, and at defending peasants' rights and trying to take care of people who are in trouble in southern Uganda, and is just one of the most heroic and charismatic politicians and a leader of this filibustering attempt. During that raid, she was secretly dragged down to the basement of Parliament and manhandled and manipulated in such a way by men wearing gloves so they would leave no finger marks, that her spine was broken in 3 places, and she was crippled. And she eventually managed to raise the money to fly to India for a 6-hour operation on her spine where they put they implanted some metal struts or something so she can kind of walk again. She's still in pain. But it's absolutely shocking. And so, yeah, that's what happens when people try to rise up against Museveni. They need us to stop supporting him because what can they do against a billion-dollar war machine? Because he essentially takes much of the money for the healthcare system, the education system, and so on, and puts it into his army. So that's what we're supporting. And as to what would happen if Museveni weren't there, nothing like the wars of the 1990s had ever happened in Africa before. I mean, of course they had wars, so did we. Look at European history, look at, the 20th century. What happened was really unique, and that was really very, very heavily Museveni driven. Not entirely, but very much so. And if you look at West and South Africa, Southern Africa, since the end of the Cold War, sure, they've got problems. But, Africans are capable of having regular democratic elections and running bureaucracies and so on. I mean, everybody complains about South Africa, look how corrupt it is. But they just had a transition of power, perfectly peaceful, no problem. Zuma stepped down. They do that a few more times and they'll be on their way. Look at Ghana, the fastest growing economy in the entire world. And, problems here and there, but we're not. So, I don't know. I really think there is an alternative. Anyway, thanks.
I just want to add just one point to that. I think the key thing here is wherever an African country can determine its destiny, essentially by itself, the prospects are much better. When the leader is beholden to a Western or outside benefactor and does not care about his own citizens or electorate, then we see the kind of excesses that we see in Uganda.
Thank you. I think we're coming down to the end of the program. Before I do that, this event is co-sponsored by with the United African Congress. And among us here, we have the President of the United African Congress, who would also was also asked to make a comment on this.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the Brooklyn for Peace for having us co-sponsor this event tonight. And also the panelists for really being brave enough to standing up for what is right and to trying to educate all of us about what is happening. I want to start by addressing my brother, that there are good things happening. But those of us who have made it our business to stand up for what is right in Africa do not necessarily share that view. And that's what people like Professor MILTON ALLIMADIi has, and a whole group of us have dedicated our lives, and as well as the other panelists, to really standing up and calling it as it is. Let me just say something that happened today. There was a Black Caucus Congressional Forum held today, Wednesday, on what? The Democratic Republic of Congo. Today, just today. And you heard, and they were holding those hearings because of what is happening in the Congo right now. I mean, people know about cobalt, the telephone stuff. Whenever financial gain from our Western powers is of a strategic interest to them, the lives of people don't matter. So only civil society could stand up against injustice. And we know and I believe, and I know this for a fact, that the American people, if they are educated on it, they are conversant with the issues involved, believe me, they will respond. And I think that's what the panelists are asking you to do. Good example. Not too long ago, there was a huge controversial election in the Republic of Sierra Leone, my country. And thanks to Black Star News, editor and publisher, we organized a press conference combined with public forum. That message resonated with the government of the United States, and they told the criminals over there that keep your hands off. We want free and fair elections. And ladies and gentlemen, Sierra Leone just inaugurated their new president, who was told could not come to the United States, and they are now giving him a red carpet to come and visit the United States. That's what people power could do. So, on balance, I'd like to suggest that Karen Bass, who is a congresswoman in California, is a very powerful person. That's one of the entry points. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that is another entry point. And in fact, don't give our politicians here in this city of New York a pass either, because some of them can do something. But if it means we have to invite them to forums like this and say, do you know what is happening? Maybe we need to do the reverse by educating them. And sometimes when you educate them, and they know there are consequences, which is the vote, and that these are issues of humanity and human rights, I think they will listen. So again, thank you very much for that.
Thank you all very much. We have come to the end of the program. I hope it's been informative. I thank the panelists who have done a wonderful job of really trying to explain a very complicated issue in a very complicated part of Africa, at the heart of which Museveni's name keeps coming up over and over again. He is the destabilizer in chief in that region. But there are things like that happening in smaller, measure in various parts of Africa. I think we have authoritarian regimes who have gained the support of the United States. All they have to do is that they're fighting terrorism, and all the dollars come flowing in. But of course, the corporate interests of the U.S. and Europe are the ones who are driving the agenda in many ways. So with that, I again thank you very much.
One quick comment.
Okay, one quick comment.
How many people saw the film Lumumba by Raoul Peck? Remember General Emile Janssen, the last Belgian commander of the army, when the Congolese soldiers were mutinying, and he wrote with chalk, he said, exactly, he said after independence equals before independence. I think part of the problem in many African countries, when we talk about independence, I believe almost all of them are independent on paper only. So these new rulers, in many cases, are now fulfilling the roles that the colonial governors used to fulfill. And the primary beneficiaries of Africa's abundant resources are not African countries or Africans, sadly. That's how I see it sometimes.
By the way, that reminds me, I think the John Campbell from the Council of Foreign Relations explaining the mission of the United States says the role of the U.S. military is to find U.S. government is to find African solution to African problems. A curious statement, by sending troops to Africa. So there you go. Thank you again, and thank you all for